I want to talk about bogs and fens, inspiration, threats, and hope. I am filled with inspiration when I think about and when I walk in bogs and fens. I know that there are threats to them, but I have immense hope that there is recovery, that the bogs and fens that I know and love will be okay as we move forward in the way that things are changing in the world. So I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about, first of all, just what the things that do inspire me, some places that I have known, definitions of bogs and fens, and then a big tour of bog and fen plants because that's what I love so much. I'm just love the plants that grow in bogs and fens, and so I'm going to talk about some of those. And then we'll close with talking about how the resiliency of bogs and fens and things that you can do to help protect bogs and fens. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So that's the plan. And here we go. So again, thank you. And I am, as I said, I am absolutely inspired by bogs wherever they are. This one is Peacham Bog in Groton, Vermont. This one is a bog near the coast of Maine, Saco Heath in Maine. Look at those gnarly or gnarled pitch pines. Beautiful, inspiring place. And there are some pitch pines in a peatland on the coast of Maine with the water droplets and the fog and sheep laurel and pitcher plant. There's a bog on the top of Mount Mansfield, and that inspires me too. How can there be a bog on the top of a mountain? It's because where there's fog, there's bog. And fens. Fens are a little bit of a different thing, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But fens are also inspiring to me wherever they are. This is Chickering Bog in Calais, another view of that beautiful fen. This is a fen in Williamstown, Vermont, just south of Barrie, which is so inspiring. This is a picture that I took last year on July 1st of last year, and this fen was just covered with showy lady slippers and other amazing wildflowers. I'm even inspired by fens when I can see them driving by on I-89 at 60 miles an hour. And this is a fen that you can see in Brookfield if you're going south on I-89. Look off to the right at about mile 40, and you will see this fen. And it's a really cool place. Don't pull over by the side of the road to go in there. It's kind of against the law. And even on the other side of the road, look at this. On the other side of the road, if you're looking to the left as you're going south, you're looking at the median. This is the median strip between the two lanes of I-89, and there's a fen in there. There's this little, this sort of grassy area in the middle is a fen. So these places are just inspiring to me. I love how this fen can just hang around in that median strip, despite the fact that it's surrounded by highway. Well, let me go back now. I want to go back actually to my childhood a little bit to tell you how I was introduced to the concept of bogs and fens. This is the first kind of fen that I knew as a child. It was the first kind of bog, rather, that I knew as a child. This is a cranberry bog. I grew up in eastern Massachusetts, spent a lot of time on Cape Cod growing up, and there are commercial cranberry bogs. As you know, Ocean Spray has a big operation there, growing cranberries on the bogs, and the bogs are managed. They have drainage ditches around them so that the water levels are managed, and they have learned from Native Americans, learned how to manage the bogs so that the cranberries grow best. They actually spread a little bit of sand on the bogs from time to time. And this is the kind of bog that I knew, and stay off the bog. So here's a bog that I knew in the wintertime. in the town that I grew up in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, they flooded the bog in the wintertime so you could go skating there. So it was basically a pond in the wintertime, but this is a managed cranberry bog, but flooded in the winter so that you could go skating. And there's my dad and my mom skating on the bog. And so this picture was taken about 1970. Then what did I know about fens growing up in Eastern Massachusetts? Well, Fenway Park. Fenway Park is named for the Fens of Boston, and the Fens of Boston are a large area of wetlands that are mostly filled in now, but there is still the Fenway. There are still wetlands, and they might look a little bit like this. This is a picture that's actually from England, the fenlands in England, and that's where the name fen came from the great fenlands of East Anglia. So that was my understanding of bogs and fens growing up. When I decided to go to college, I ended up going to the University of Maine, and in Maine there are lots of bogs. And the first job that I had when I left the University of Maine was on a Nature Conservancy preserve on the coast of Maine called Great Wass Island. And I'm going to show you, this is just a little nostalgia, a couple of actually slides back in the old days when we had Kodachrome slides. And this is a picture of where I lived on Great Wass Island. It was a beautiful place, an island that was really way out and sticking way out in the ocean. You can drive there. There's a bridge that goes there, but I was really, really quite out in the ocean. And this is, again, a terrible photo because it's very old, but it gives you a sense of where I was at that time. And this is a peatland, looking out over some bedrock, over some granite ledges into this bog that is on Great Wass Island. The place was just covered with bogs. There were bogs everywhere. And there were things like this little cloudberry plant, Rubus camimoris, was one of the things growing in the bogs on Great Wass Island. And black crowberry, the plant that looks almost like a moss, is the thing in this picture here. So this is my sense of, I was totally inspired by these bogs and felt very, very fortunate to be able to spend time in bogs as my first job out of college. But here's another thing. This island, Great Wass Island, is right off of Jonesport, Maine. And I'm going to show you an aerial photograph of what is known as the Jonesport Heath, the Jonesport Bog. And this is what it looks like. This is a Google image, a little bit fuzzy, but you can see that this bog has been ditched and drained. So this bog has major drainage ditches through it, and then some minor ditches alongside those. And the reason for that was this is a commercial peat bog. So this is a place where they where they harvest peat for horticultural use. It's a fascinating process. They ditch and drain the bog, and then it dries out to about a little less than a half an inch of the surface is completely dry at that point. And then these giant vacuum harvesters go over the bog, vacuum up that top half an inch or so of peat, and toss it back into a holding tank, where it is then brought back in and turned into peat moss. Or bagged up as peat moss. And this is the commercial peat moss that many people use in gardening. This one is a product of Canada, this particular Premier peat moss. It's a big company. But that this practice occurs on the coast of Maine as well, not so much in Vermont. So that was something really interesting. And one thing that I did and in my time in Maine between college and graduate school was I worked for the Maine Critical Areas program, and they were at the time, this person, Ian Worley, was working. He is a professor at the University of Vermont, and he was working for the state of Maine to create a report on Maine peatlands and recommendations for which ones of those peatlands should be recognized as significant natural areas. He recommended the Jonesport Heath, in spite of the fact that the Jonesport Heath was ditched and drained and is a commercial enterprise. And this was work that was taking place in the main planning office, and the supervisor in the main planning office told me that I had to take that section out of the report. I was editing the report for them. He told me that I had to take that section out of the report. He did not want a commercial peatland in a report on natural areas. And I refused. Refused to take it out of the report, and they fired me. So I just felt that and Ian Worley felt that recognizing this peatland, even though it's ditched and drained, as a significant peatland, which it still is and was and is, was important. Next stop on my journey in peatlands was in graduate school. I then came over from Maine to the University of Vermont to study with Ian Worley. And in my research for my master's degree took me up to Schefferville, Quebec, which is in the Quebec-Labrador Peninsula. And this is on the Labrador, this is the town of Schefferville on the Quebec-Labrador border. You can see that this is a town, right? But it's surrounded by wilderness. The town was built for the purpose of iron mining in that area. So there are big, huge iron mines in Schefferville and around Schefferville. But the general landscape looks a lot like this. There is just water everywhere, peatlands everywhere. And this is the kind of peatland that I was interested in studying in Schefferville and in Labrador. This is a string-patterned peatland, mysterious, curious, just fascinating peatlands. And this is not my study site, but this looks a lot like my study site, where there are these linear features in the peatlands. So these kinds of peatlands are just everywhere on that landscape in northern Quebec. So when I was in Schefferville, the social life in Schefferville there wasn't much, but there was one bar, and we'd go to the bar at night and have a couple beers, and we would encounter we would socialize with and see Native people, Cree Indians, who had been transported out of their homelands and to Schefferville with the idea that they would have jobs in the iron mines. It turns out that most of them never did have jobs in the iron mines, and they were mostly living on welfare. What I knew very little about at that time, I knew of it, but I didn't really know the magnitude of it, was that they had been transported out of their lands in part because of the development of hydropower in Quebec, in the Hydro-Quebec project, called the James Bay Project. These are fuzzy photos, not great, but this gives you a sense of what that James Bay Hydro Project looked like. It was started in the 1970s. Again, a fuzzy photo from a website, but this is approximately what that landscape looked like beforehand and what it looked like after. So again, terrible photos, but you can see that it was wild rivers and wild water and just flooded and mud flats and dead trees afterwards. So I'll say more about that in a minute. So again, on my personal journey, other things that I did a few years later, traveled to England and visited the fenlands of East Anglia. That cathedral in the background is Ely Cathedral in East Anglia, and it is known as the Ship of the Fens, the Ship of the Fens. And the Fens are the vast, vast, vast wetlands of East Anglia. And here you can see what they look like. They have been completely ditched and drained and converted to agricultural use. These used to be very large natural wetlands. You can see there are cows grazing in this one, but this has a little bit more of a natural sense. But most of them have been converted, and there's these massive sluiceways and this whole drainage system, and people go boating on these waterways. It's just a completely different landscape from what it was originally. And then a few years later, actually just a couple years ago, a visit to Ireland, where I saw this large bog. This picture was taken from a bicycle trip that I was on a rail trail, and just surrounded by this vast area of bogs with ditches and drains in the bog, and then these blocks of peat that were sitting by the side of the ditches. And so this is commercially harvested peat, and it is something that has been done in Ireland and Scotland, in the British Isles, for many years. You know that peat is used to fuel homes in the British Isles, and also to flavor beverages like certain kinds of scotch. So I came home from that trip with a gift from my sister. The fellow on the left is holding a little bag of Irish turf, as they call it, or Irish peat. And this was a handmade doll by a woman in that part of Ireland. So that exemplifies what goes on in Ireland. Well, okay, so there's a little bit of my sort of personal history with bogs and fens, and what I came to know as places that had been really converted to uses that were to human uses, used for human habitation. I visited and understood and knew many very natural and beautiful bogs and fens over my time, but a lot of noticed a lot of degradation. So starting with my journey in Vermont, my work in Vermont, I'm just going to now bring you on a tour of some bogs and fens in Vermont that I have studied over the last number of years, starting with your own beloved Woodward Reservoir and the bog that is there. So the floating bog. And I want to just really thank Sally Laughlin, my friend, who I believe is here in this webinar, who sent me these photos of Woodward Reservoir. She spends a lot of time there and has taken lots of wonderful photos. And there's a picture of the bog taken from the water. I visited this bog in 1986. It's one of the first places that I visited when I started doing work in Vermont in 1984. And when I looked for the data on this bog from the Heritage Program, it was the main piece of information they still have is my 1986 report. But they're well aware of it and know about it and know the significance of it. And it's mapped in the ANR Atlas as a significant natural area. Here's another photo of it. And then basking turtles, and it's a loon nesting area, as some of you will know. So there are the loons. And again, thank you, Sally, for these great photos. And pitcher plant growing there, and rose begonia growing there. Just a fabulous place. Well, so moving along, I want to now just pause for a second and talk about what are bogs and fens. Bogs and fens are peatlands. I've used that word already. Bogs and fens are peatlands. So what is a peatland? A peatland is land made of peat. What is peat? P-E-A-T. Peat is simply undecomposed or partially decomposed organic matter. This is my colleague, Bob Zano. You see he's holding in his hand some black earth, and that is peat. And he's got in his right hand a soil auger. And so you see, if he puts the soil auger down into the soil in this bog, this is actually a fen, you can see it goes all the way down, and could go much further down if it were longer. That peat auger, you can see in his hand, it's about maybe 3 feet long. But there it is, and there's some of the peat that he has pulled out of this peatland. And there it is, a little bit of a closer look. So you can see, you can recognize some of the plant parts in there. And peat can be made up of anything organic. It is sometimes made of wood. It is sometimes made of sedges. It is sometimes made of moss. So when you see the bags of peat moss, the tourbe, or that I showed you, that is sphagnum moss. So that is or sphagnum peat. So that is peat that is composed primarily of sphagnum moss or peat moss. But peat can be made from anything organic. And peat deposits over time. So in this fen that Bob is standing in this photo, the peat was about 16 feet deep. So underneath him, there's about 16 feet of organic matter or peat. And let me tell you, that's a lot of peat, and that is a lot of carbon. So bogs and fens, I'm using the term bogs and fens, and we define bogs and fens as peatlands. And the difference between a bog and a fen is in part the source, largely the source of the water. So the water in a bog comes primarily from precipitation, from rain, or from dew, or from fog, as is the case on Mount Mansfield and on the coast of Maine. And then a fen is fed by groundwater, or water seeping out of the ground and moving through. Now this usually in bogs, because of the nature of where the water comes from, the pH is quite on the acidic end of things. So the water is very acidic. Rainwater is naturally acidic, even before acid rain. Rainwater is naturally acidic. And then the groundwater, in a lot of Vermont, the groundwater moves through limestone bedrock, and when it emerges, it has lots of calcium in it, calcium carbonate, and it is on the alkaline end of the pH spectrum. Now, this series of samples, of soil samples, was taken from a single place. But the one on the top, so if you look at the soil reaction and lime chart on the right, you can see that the bluer colors are more neutral or alkaline, and the more orange color is acidic or extremely acidic. And so the sample tray on the left has a range, and at the bottom, that sample was taken from the top of a hummock. So the top of a hummock in this peatland where the groundwater does not touch it. But this is a peatland that is fed by groundwater, and in a hollow in that peatland, the groundwater is having an influence on the vegetation. So there's a difference between the hummocks and the hollows in terms of their acidity and in terms of their vegetation, in everything. And these changes happen laterally over just a few inches. Literally. So this can show you, if I were to just look at this sample, I would say, oh, that's from a bog. And if I were to look at this top sample, I would say, oh, that's from a fen. But these were in fact taken from the same location. So we call a situation like this what some researchers will call it a mixed mire or a mixed peatland, has some aspects of bog and some of fen. But in Vermont, we have a lot of bogs and we have a lot of fens, and we have some that are mixed, like this one. Well, what about peatland distribution worldwide? Peatlands, this is the Global Peatlands Initiative did a study a few years back, and this is really wonderful information. This map shows the distribution of peatlands throughout the globe. And you can see that peatlands are mostly in the northern hemisphere. And look, there's peatlands all over the place in Siberia, northern Eurasia, and then in Canada, northern Canada. And if you were to zoom in on this map, you would see that there are areas of peatlands in other places. You could see, if you look closely, you can see that the Everglades shows up as a place where there are peatlands, and other places along the coast. And these are mangrove swamps or other kinds of peatlands. And then the lighter color is peat in the soil mosaic. So there's peat, a lot of peat, but not necessarily, the soil's not necessarily 100% peat, but only partial peat. So fascinating information here. And interestingly, peatlands cover about 3% of the land area of the globe. and they hold about 1/3 of the world's carbon. That is really, really important information. 3% of the world's land area, but 1/3 of the world's carbon, more than the world's forests. So that's where the carbon is. It's in the forest, yes, but it's also in the peatlands. Well, okay. So that's all some interesting stuff. And but now I'm going to go just take you on a tour of some bogs and fens in Vermont and their flora. And this is really just a fun flora tour. And then after this, we'll talk about the hope here, the hope in these peatlands. This is Peach Bog, as I said, in Groton, Vermont. You've seen this picture before. This is in the fall. This is tamarack or larch with cotton grass, and the reddish color is sheep laurel. Beautiful, beautiful bog. And this is South Alberg Swamp in the islands in South Alberg. And you can see these pom-pom tops of the black spruce. So black spruce is a common plant, and the black spruce, the plants, the trees that are not tamarack here, the green ones are black spruce, and they're very common in bogs and on the top of Mount Mansfield as well. Some other plants that grow in bogs, many members of the heath family, the blueberry family, grow in bogs and fens. And you have probably, maybe you've heard this, but they are especially good. And if you grow anything like laurel, you know that the laurels actually grow really well, and blueberries do grow really well in acidic soils. They actually even prefer acidic soils, which is very unusual for plants that you would grow. This is sheep laurel that grows in bogs and fens. It also grows in uplands, but most commonly in Vermont, you'll find it in bogs and fens. So you can recognize these flowers. If you know mountain laurel, you'll recognize those flowers. And this, on the other hand, is bog laurel, very similar flowers, but the leaves are different. You see, these are opposite leaves that are leathery. And many members of the heath family do have leathery, evergreen leaves, and that helps them to survive in this, what is basically kind of a harsh environment. Bogs and fens are a difficult environment nutritionally. There's not a lot of nitrogen, and also they stay cold well into the spring. So photosynthesis, in order to start photosynthesizing early, they actually keep their leaves. Many of them actually keep their leaves and are evergreen. There's sheep laurel, again, later in the year. So the leaves turn a little bit orangey, and they'll hold on to those leaves throughout the year. Those are the fruits of sheep laurel. And here is leatherleaf, not leatherleaf, but rather Labrador tea. And if you look underneath, you can see how fuzzy these leaves are, but they're really super fuzzy underneath. Just a really lovely plant. It's called Labrador tea because you can make a tea from those leaves. Don't confuse it with sheep laurel, though, because which you wouldn't, but some people actually have. It has happened because sheep laurel is poisonous. It's also called lamb's kill. So it is a poisonous plant, whereas this one is one you can make tea out of. And there's the beautiful flowers of the Labrador tea. Another one is bog rosemary, unrelated to rosemary that we use in cooking. But this is a member of the heath family. Of course, you can recognize this flower as a blueberry-like flower. And this one is leatherleaf, which is just a fascinating plant with these really funny dots on the leaves, but very recognizable. Again, evergreen, or you might want to say ever red. Really, the leaves are green, but they have a very strong reddish cast to them. And then high bush blueberry grows in bogs. And this is actually going this is the blueberry that I knew as a child on Cape Cod, the one that grew in the wetlands there, where we would go and harvest those blueberries later in the summer. Then we talked about cranberry bogs earlier. This is small cranberry, and which is the most common cranberry in Vermont. And it's such an amazing flower. Also in the heath family, also in the blueberry family. But this is a very, very tiny thing. There's two species of cranberry, large cranberry and small cranberry. This is the most common one in Vermont. And then this one is mountain cranberry. And this photo was taken on the top of Mount Mansfield. So this is a rare plant in Vermont, actually. And when I was on the coast of Maine, it's fairly common there, but it's quite rare in Vermont. So you have to go to the top of Mount Mansfield, or there's actually a couple of lowland places in the Northeast Kingdom where you can find this as well, but quite a rare plant in Vermont. And then this is a view of a peatland in the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge. And this is a fall view of huckleberry turning just bright, bright red in the fall. So those are some members of the heath family, but what else do we have in bogs? We have sedges. We have cottongrass, which is there's many species, several species of cottongrass in Vermont. This one is called hare's tail cottongrass. This is the one that grows on the top of Mount Mansfield. And it doesn't only grow there, but that's the common one if you go to the bog on the top of Mount Mansfield, which, by the way, you can see from the Sunset Ridge, not the Sunset Ridge Trail, but the main trail on the top of Mount Mansfield that goes up to the summit. And there's a close look at the hare's tail cottongrass. And then this cottongrass, this is a different species, and this is in South Alberg Swamp. And if you look closely at this early in the year, you see how it's sort of brownish in color. And then this is what it looks like when it's fully mature. But this is called tawny cottongrass, a very common one in many of our bogs and fens. And this one is called mud sedge. This is a plant that's called mud sedge that grows in fens mostly. And then this one looks very similar, but it's different. And this one is called poor sedge. So these two sedges, they're sort of twin sedges. This one grows in fens, this one grows in bogs. And this was taken on the top of Mount Mansfield again. This one is called yellow sedge. This grows mostly in fens. And if you look carefully at this picture, think about what's in the background there. What is that thing in the back? That's a showy lady slipper. So that pink and white thing in the background of this photo is a showy lady slipper. But this is yellow sedge, which grows in calcareous fens. And then this one is called white beak rush, which also grows in calcareous fens. You can see the water in the background. And here we have alpine bulrush growing in fens. This is another cotton grass, like the big cotton, but this one's very tiny, delicate, diminutive thing, a little tiny cotton grass called alpine bulrush, but it grows in lowlands, in fens. And there it is. There's a close-up look at it. Those long, skinny things, those are projections of the seed. They're not exactly petals of the flower, but what they are for is to distribute the seeds or the fruits so that they just fly on the wind with these long skinny hairs and go and find new habitat. This is one called prairie sedge, which is something of an unusual sedge that grows in fens. And then this one is called twig rush. And the really fun thing about this plant that I want to tell you is it grows in that median strip fen I showed you near the beginning. This is a very rare plant in Vermont. It grows in only about, 10 or 12 places in Vermont that we know about, but it grows in that median strip fen. It also grows in more natural fens, but very recognizable from a distance, actually. I mean, I did like driving by, I can recognize it by its deep color. This is a very close-up view of the thing, but it grows about 2 feet tall. And so when there's a whole bunch of it, you can recognize it really by its color, even going 60 miles an hour. Here's another one that I probably wouldn't recognize at 60 miles an hour. This one's called pew-flowered sedge. That's very, very tiny. Those little individual things are quarter to a third of an inch long. And this one's pew-seeded sedge, a totally different species. That's pew-flowered sedge. This is pew-seeded sedge. This one's a little bit unusual, and it grows in bogs. And then, of course, there are the insectivorous plants, which sometimes we call carnivorous plants. There's a few things that grow in our bogs and fens that eat insects. And so right in this photo here, you can see the glistening dewdrops, or they're actually not exactly dewdrops, but this is sundew. So I'll show you the in the center of this picture. This is sundew, and and the sundew plant has these projections, these hairs, with a sticky substance at the tip where an insect will land and get stuck. And you can see in this picture, there's a fly or an insect that has landed on the leaf there in the lower left and will get stuck there, can't move because of the sticky substance, and then will be digested by the plant. Again, I said the nutrients, certain nutrients like nitrogen, are really in short supply in peatlands, and so getting nitrogen from animals is a way to do it. Then the pitcher plant, this pitcher plant up in the upper right, you can see just barely, you can see the hairs going down into the pitcher. This is another strategy. So an insect will land on this inner part of the pitcher plant, slide down in on those hairs, can't get back out because the hairs are pointing down, and there's water in there, and the water contains enzymes. The plant is secreted enzymes that mix with the rainwater that falls into the plant, and the animal is digested in there. A very, very clever adaptation. There's the flower of pitcher plant. I had one of Sally's photos from Woodward Reservoir earlier, and this is another photo of the flower of pitcher plant. Fascinating, beautiful, beautiful plant with just amazing color. And this is where an insect would go in onto this. You can't really see, but there's a platform here. An insect would go in to land and get nectar and pollinate the plant. Here's another one. This is called bladderwort, and I don't. It's hard to see where the action happens on this plant, which is also an insectivorous plant. This one is growing in the water in a fen, and it under the water or in the very, very saturated soil, there are bladders that hold the plant up, and also there are structures that actually will capture insects. So nematodes mostly that are swimming around in the water. This underground structure will actually tighten around a nematode that comes through it, and that's its way of capturing an insect and then digesting it for nutrition. Other things that grow in bogs and fens, which are just some pretty amazing things. This is winterberry holly, which is something this is actually not an evergreen plant. So this is a holly. It's in the same genus as the holly and the ivy and all that. The holly, the holly bears a berry, all those things that the holly that we use for Christmas decorations. But this one actually loses its leaves in the winter, so you can see just the berries. And there's a close-up look at the wonderful berries of winterberry holly. Other interesting things, this is a really, really close-up view of a black spruce twig. Those leaves, those needles of the black spruce are about 1/4 of an inch long. And these little globular things are actually this is a plant called dwarf mistletoe, which is a parasitic plant that grows on black spruce. And it's hard to find, but what it does is it causes the plant to grow in witch's brooms. So if you see these clusters of branches on a black spruce, look closely and you might very well find this dwarf mistletoe. Now, so holly and the mistletoe, right? So this is related to the mistletoe that is used in Christmas traditions, but that's a southern plant, and this is a northern plant. A very similar life story. That's also a parasitic plant, and this one is, but it's very, very tiny, not showy. Okay, so now we got the orchids. Of course, we've got the orchids. I just love the orchids that grow in peatlands. And this was that same peatland that I visited, that fen that I visited last year on July 1st, which in the fen was just covered with showy lady slippers, just and other flowers too, other wildflowers too, but it was just stunningly beautiful. Interestingly, many of these showy lady slippers were on the pale side. Sometimes they can be much darker pink than this, but many of them were quite pale and just stunningly beautiful. There's a close-up of the fruit of the seed pod or fruit of the showy lady slippers with the flowers in the background. And showing there's a more dark colored showy lady slipper. This was taken at another location, so you can see where it can be very dark. Interesting, such an interesting flower structure. But getting back to the seed pod, I showed that, I guess, partly because the seeds themselves are tiny, tiny, tiny. There are thousands of seeds in each pod, and they blow in the wind, and they must land in a place that has most orchids, all orchids that I know of in our region have a symbiotic relationship with a fungus. They need to land in a place where that fungus grows so that they can grow successfully. And that is really one of the reasons that you should never, there are lots of good reasons not to transplant orchids, but that's one of them. You probably won't be successful because you won't have that, symbiosis in the soil. Other orchids, grass pink, calopogon, rose begonia. On this rose begonia flower, you can see those little strands. Those are actually the strands of the alpine bulrush that have been floating on the wind. Arethusa, or grass pink. This one is a tall, narrow orchid in the genus Platanthera, and it is called white bog orchis or bog candles. Beautiful thing that actually has a beautifully fragrant odor. Iris, this is our common blue flag iris, but it grows in fens, and you can see in this picture actually there's a spider on the back side of that stalk. This is a swamp thistle, a rare plant, kind of a rare plant actually, this swamp thistle that grows in fens. Calms lobelia, a close-up look at it. A lobelia that grows really only in fens and calcareous seeps. And this is bog buckbean, which grows in bogs and fens. And then we have, this one is water avens. And I've focused this one to look at the fruit. Look at this fascinating fruit of water avens. Most of our species of avens are white or yellow. This one is this beautiful reddish color. And another reddish, unusually reddish member of a usually yellow genus. This is a potentilla. This is a cinquefoil, and this is marsh cinquefoil or swamp cinquefoil, which has red flowers, whereas most of our cinquefoils have yellow flowers. But speaking of yellow flowers, this is bog goldenrod, which grows in bogs and fens. So yes, there are lots of goldenrods. They're all native. Lots of goldenrods in Vermont. They're all native, and this one really just grows in bogs and fens. Recognizable because it's sort of tall and narrow, unlike some of our other goldenrods. And then this one here is a ragwort that is another member of the aster family, like the goldenrod, that grows in bogs and fens. And finally, of course, there are mosses galore in bogs and fens. Sphagnum mosses, 20 plus species in Vermont. I'm not going to go through them, but there's lots of them. They're all different colors and shapes and sizes. And here's another, not a sphagnum moss, but here's another moss that grows only on moose dung. This is called moose dung moss. And there's a close-up of it. What a fascinating moss. Thanks to my friend Grace Glynn for this photo. Some other mosses that grow in peatlands, and there you can see the sundew as well growing in these mosses. That one's called starry moss. And I'm going to end my botany tour here with this, and I'm going to read you a poem, if you can indulge me, from Ralph Waldo Emerson. In May, when the sea winds pierced our solitudes, I found the fresh rhodora in the woods. This is rhodora. Spreading its leafless blooms in a damp nook, to please the desert and the sluggish brook. The purple petals fallen in the pool made the black water with their beauty gay. Here might the redbird come his plumes to cool and court the flower that cheapens his array. Rhodora, if the sages ask thee why this charm is wasted on the earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. And it goes on from there. Well, so now to some hope. This global assessment of the world's peatlands that I mentioned before really brought attention to the importance of peatlands and their role in carbon storage. And so many great things have happened. Going back to my childhood, look at this. The bog that I grew up with is now a reservation. It's now a natural area recognized as such and set aside for people to appreciate and enjoy. The Jonesport Heath, it's a natural area recognized by the state of Maine now. I'm so happy about those, thrilled about that. And in the UK, the UK has set out a cogent case for the restoration of 1 million hectares of peatland. The lot, that is all of them, the complete restoration of Britain's peatlands. So really great news. So restoring the fens to what they should look like. And the peat mining in Ireland is no longer allowed on a commercial basis. It's allowed on a personal basis, but no longer allowed on a commercial basis. And then finally, just some resilience. Look at this. This is a bog laurel growing right up through a boardwalk. And the peat moss just wants to grow. Look, it's growing up over the pitcher plant. It's engulfing the pitcher plant. It's engulfing this trail. It's engulfing this trail. It's engulfing this trail. Peat just wants to grow. It just wants to keep growing. And we now have many protected peatlands that we can visit. Peacham Bog, protected by the state of Vermont. Colchester Bog, protected by the University of Vermont. Please stay on the boardwalk. And the Nature Conservancy's Eshqua Bog and Chickering Bog. And then in the Conti Refuge, Molly Beatty Bog, named for Molly Beatty, who was a great advocate for conservation, up in the Silvio Conti Refuge. And then Missisquoi Refuge, as I mentioned earlier, is protecting a large peatland in its domain. So I would just implore you to keep looking. Look close, like my friend and colleague and mentor, Eric Sorensen, and just enjoy the peatlands like all these students from the University of Vermont are doing, and hang out, get down, get dirty, enjoy. And there's some resources, a few books, and if you read only one book, please read this one by Annie Prue, Fen, Bog, and Swamp. It's a really fascinating story about peatlands and the threats to them and what we can do. So thank you very much. That's the end, and we have a few minutes now for questions, so I will leave it over to Elizabeth to manage those questions.
All right, thank you so much, Liz. That was amazing. Learned so much about bogs and fens. So folks, gather your thoughts. If you have any questions, you can pop those in the chat. Wait a couple of seconds. All right, so the first question we have is, in addition to carbon storage, do peatlands play a role in maintaining the water quality where they're found? If so, how do they do that? What do they do?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. Yeah, absolutely, they do. They filter water, depending upon the kind of peatland. Yes, water that comes into a peatland is filtered by the peat itself and can potentially come out different, different in quality than when it went in. A lot of things get absorbed by the peat. Yeah, so it absorbs a lot of nutrients.
Great. All right. Any other questions from folks? It's a lot of great information. Another one, did Olmsted respect the bog fen areas in his development of the Green Necklace Parks of Boston? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I don't know very much about that, the Emerald Necklace or Green Necklace, yeah, parks in Boston, but yes, absolutely. The wetlands are part of that park system. Yeah, but I don't know that much about the details.
Great. Okay. Any other questions from folks? That was so much wonderful information. Hope it inspired everyone to get out there this spring and summer for all these amazing plants. All right, well, I think that's all the questions. If anyone thinks of anything, feel free to email me and I can direct that to Liz. But thanks so much, Liz. This was wonderful, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care, everybody.